I want to actually discuss an interesting article that occurred in New Perspectives Quarterly, which was like 2015, and it was an interview with someone who I regard as the greatest philosopher of all time, Peter Sloterdijk. And of course, the article is titled, "Controversial Philosopher Says Man and Machine Will Fuse into One Being." Now, I think that's true, right? And by the way, I find it interesting that like a lot of people nowadays are willing to accept that thought, but are less willing to accept certain ideas of, let's say, transgender personalities or something. But I think both of these ideas speak actually for the issue that we are not limited to our biological organism and that human essence is basically something that is free. And Sloterdijk has very interesting thoughts regarding this. So therefore, let's read the article. I should have shown that a bit earlier, right? Let's read the article. And he's asked right at the beginning, well, for years now, you have been arguing that a new type of being was coming into existence as the human species fuses with its technological prosthetics, anthropotechnology. In this new being, man and machine are becoming one integrated operative system linked by information. All these years later, our consciousness has expanded into the cloud and the cloud into our consciousness. Now, of course, this is a little bit exaggerated. I don't think that our consciousness has expanded in the cloud. That's nonsense, right? We still have pretty much singularized consciousnesses that somehow interact with others, and we could maybe say, well, we have an intersubjective consciousness, okay, but I don't see that our consciousness has dramatically changed through the influence of the cloud, or let's say by the introduction of TikTok. Nevertheless, they ask, well, how's your thought that we are changing ourselves and maybe coming together with artificial intelligence different from Ray Kurzweil's idea of singularity? And yeah, before Peter Sloterdijk can answer that, he first has to explain what is anthropotechnics, because it's a bit different from what the person who asked the question actually understands. Technically, anthropotechnology just describes how we as human beings, and not as single human beings, start to form each other through different devices. And this is what he is going to explain here. He says, the human being, especially in so-called advanced civilizations, is the animal that molds itself into its own pet. While evolution means adaptation to a natural environment, domestication means from the outset adaptation to the artificial. So in other words, we are not like exposing ourselves to external pressures anymore, but we are producing pressures within something that is called a civilization. And of course, we would also ask, what is a civilization? And in this regard, he says, well, a civilization is the result of a long sequence of auto-domestications. Domestications, auto means just the self here. And he says, well, the imperative was not so much know thyself. It was way more the imperative of tame thyself. Now, however, what he wants to point out here is that there is no merging event, no final state that we approach. He just says, well, the future of what I have in mind is fundamentally open. So this is actually something that I should also have marked here, right? Firstly, it describes the largely unconscious cession of humans from pure animality, whereby they become not only members of the symbolic species, a ritual enemy, indeed a mythological narrative animal, but a technical creature. And okay, this part was not so important. Actually, this here is important. Secondly, it points to future possibilities of conscious self-shaping through forms of training of the mind, through chemical modifications, and perhaps even through genetic impulses. So yeah, and we see here already how it is different from Ray Kurzweil, because it points towards an open future. And again, I believe that emphasizes our essence, that we can turn ourselves into something else, and that human beings are the being that is fundamentally open. And this is also what Sloterdijk repeats then. It is empirical, pluralistic, and egalitarian from the ground up, in the sense that all individuals as heirs to the memory of mankind are free to surpass themselves. Ray Kurzweil's idea of singularity, by contrast, contains futuristic, monistic, and elitist elements. So I don't know what he means here by futuristic. Monistic means probably that it eliminates the possibility of a certain dualism. So I don't think that Sloterdijk defends a dualism, but he also does not defend a monism. Maybe that's the difference here. Monism means that there's just there's no division between mind and body, right? And so there he's probably a little bit more open towards the possibility of transcendence. And then he said, and it's elitist, right? And he explains this, although singularity, according to its logical and rhetorical design, is meant to integrate mankind as a whole, it is evident that it could only encompass a tiny group of exceptional transhuman individuals. Yes, and this is the big question, right? Will these new technologies indeed benefit everyone, or will they create a new class? Now we have a class of billionaires, that's probably undeniable, that theoretically people can join. That's part of the grand illusion, right? And the fact that people join that class, it's just cementing the illusion that everybody could achieve that. Well, not everybody can, obviously, achieve these elite positions. And the question is whether that also applies to the singularity, or we had to ask, why should it not apply to the singularity? Yeah, and then he has some more interesting ideas on the cloud, which I just found interesting. So Kurzweil argues that our minds will actually expand into the cloud, whatever that means. This is a bold statement with regard to the future. The future will change a lot, right? And we can also make claims about the singularity. I don't feel that's absurd, but why would we want to become part of a super consciousness in the cloud? It sounds like a Borg vision, right? Why should it be positive, I would ask. And Sloterdijk actually makes a reference to Hegel, which I like, because Hegel is the philosopher that I wrote my PhD dissertation about it. So, and he says, with his concept of the objective spirit, Hegel outlined the formal premise of a cloud. These consist in the expression of the spirit, which have solidified into institutions. Institutions are programs for cultural transmission handed down to future generations. So I think the idea is basically we have subjective minds, right? And we cannot really know reality, but somehow we create something with our subjective minds, and these things are objective, and we call them spirits. And people, hold on, I don't want to talk about spirits here. I'm like an atheist, right? So maybe, but I think he has a way simpler idea here. It's actually, so when we look at the building of a school, technically it is just a building, and even more technically it's a heap of stones that maybe dogs couldn't differentiate from, let's say, a cave, right, in its functionality. Maybe they can, but ants certainly wouldn't. They would say, oh, another kind of mountainish thing. But then, okay, we identify it as a building, and beyond that, we identify it as a school. But a school building does not necessarily look different from, let's say, a certain type of, I don't know, like a certain type of an office building. Probably not, because you have arranged tables. Well, maybe you can form your own example for understanding my argument here. Because what I want to say, what makes a school building to a school building, is the subjective interactions of the people who are involved, and they have certain rituals, right? Every morning the bell rings and so on and so forth. And it's kind of cloudy, right? We don't really know what it is. I mean, we know it in the larger context because we send our children there and then they're supposed to learn something, but it's a bit unclear what it is overall. And he actually describes it here through the metaphor of a cloud, which I find genius again, yeah, that he just shoots in Hegel here, and then even has a way of transforming the metaphor, and that's what Sloterdijk usually can do. So clouds are liquidized institutions, as it were, in which the mass of prior experience that is capable and worthy of transmission is made available for later interested parties. The difference between a cloud and a school reveals itself in the fact that in the former the autodidactic factor increases, whereas schools as prototypes of formal institutions are principally heterodidactic. That means authoritative and conservative, heterodomesticated in their structures. Now, I don't understand everything here. Like, why are they heterodidactic? So that seems to me, hetero-autonomy means that your will is usually determined by something else, right? While autonomy, heteronomy, I cannot express this. Autonomy means that you're doing it yourself. So schools actually tell the students what they should learn. In a cloud, you somehow decide what you want to learn, right? And then heterodomesticative means that somebody else domesticates you, while I guess autodomesticative means that you are training yourself, right? And this is then what he says here. Schools can never be entirely sure of passing on what is worth knowing, and cloud visitors are all the more incapable of distinguishing with certainty between nonsense and no nonsense. And that is certainly also why, no insult to the flat earthers, but why we have such stupid theories are going around. Because if a level of traditional authority is dismissed, right, we sometimes also dismiss the traditional mechanisms that guarantee a certain kind of progress in knowledge and that guarantee that we build plateaus that are more reliable. So I'm very aware that I'm not using any kind of corrector that is reality or something. I just say, like, in society we build certain plateaus that usually prove themselves to be worthy to be maintained. Like, I mean, nobody wants to get away with all tradition, or as a friend of mine always says, we have to destroy everything and build a new when we do, for example, engineering. That's kind of false, right? But of course, at the same time, once you have this traditional structure, right, then the question is, how can we achieve innovation? And yeah, we see here that Sloterdijk then comes also to the dangers of the clouds, right, where he says, we saw already in the 19th century how far the objective spirit can transform into an ideology and a communicative plague. And it actually institutionalized untruths, right? And that was maybe more typical of the 20th century, as he says here. And that's maybe also a question of what will happen in the future of the cloud, where the demons of the propaganda have returned in digitally updated form. Also, again, a great metaphor. Yeah, and then he has a further great reflection on the word artificial intelligence, where he just says, well, that's the idea that somehow what we produce in computers survives the production process and becomes something that lives without the help of us, right? It's a kind of perpetuum mobile, like the mind. It's another metaphor that I use here, but he actually writes, what is objective is the intelligence invested in tools, works, and institutions by their producers, which subsequently separated from them to be absorbed and applied by other intelligences. So for him, it is just a narrative of expansion where other forms of mind take over what was produced by us as participating in that kind of objective spirit, or as he calls it, the cloud. Postmodern humans not only live in the house of being anymore, famous phrase of Heidegger of how he described language, but increasingly in the abode of the technosphere. So the house of being is not anymore achieved merely through language, although Heidegger has a very broad conception of language, but maybe also with ChatGPT we see that the house of being is in a certain sense technologized, but Heidegger would say, no, that's not yet a house of being. Like, this is empty language, the way ChatGPT describes that. Nevertheless, that is another question. I hope you enjoyed this little snippet of philosophy from my favorite philosopher. And yeah, I hope that you followed this channel. The question is really, what will happen in 100 years? Where will we be? I think the world will be unimaginably different. And I cannot wait to see what happens. But of course, there are also a lot of worries that we are not using it to our advantage. Will the singularity, the paradise that Ray Kurzweil promises? I think it will be a transformation of capitalism, and similarly to how we treat lower existences right now, lower intelligence existences, we probably will treat ourselves that way in the future. That's my worry. If it is true is another question. What is your opinion? Let me know in the comments. Share, like, and subscribe. Expansion is all. And for the rest, I can just say, live long. Yeah, become a transhuman and prosper. Bye-bye.